These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? This time white's queen is the piece that is cramped, it's up against the side of the board with little room to retreat. Black considers a threat against it with pawn from g6 moves to g5. Where will the queen go? It gets captured if it moves to h5 or to anywhere on the fourth rank, look and see. So it has to move to h3. Yet now its relationship with the knight on f3 calls for a pawn fork, pawn from g5 moves to g4 wins the knight, with black's own knight at f6 supplying the needed protection for the pawn. In the game this position came from, between Tal and Botvinnik, it was white's turn to move. Tal played n-pawn from c3 moves to d5. Now if black plays pawn from g6 moves to g5, white plays knight takes knight f6 plus. Since this checks the king, black can't play pawn from g5 takes queen, he has to capture white's knight. After that exchange gets rid of the knight on f6, white's queen has plenty of flight squares and the fire is out. But of course the first important point in all this is for white to recognize that he is in danger. The tip-off is the immobility of his queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Forks by marching pawns. What white pieces are poised to be forked by a pawn? The bishop and knight on f3 and h3 are in the classic position. Black can't get a pawn onto g4 in one move, but he can march it there, and leave white no time to defend itself, by playing pawn from g6 moves to g5, threatening white's f4 bishop. The bishop runs away, and now pawn from g5 moves to g4 wins a piece. The black pawn on f5 provides the necessary cover, of course. Notice that your opponent can thrash around a bit. After the initial pawn push, white can throw in a capture elsewhere like pawn from c4 takes at d5. In this case black just recaptures with his e-pawn and the forking threat is both renewed and unavoidable for white, but the point is that you always want to make sure you have considered what counterplay your opponent might be able to offer elsewhere on the board. This is especially important when the sequence you contemplate doesn't threaten the enemy with anything more than the loss of a piece, i.e., you have no checks in the picture, because he may then be able to buy time by making similar or worse threats of his own elsewhere. In this case it's not an issue, however, white has no effective way to derail the fork. White to move. What is the best move? The same idea once more. The first thing is to train your eye to see two pieces lined up with a single square between them, as black's queen and knight are arranged in this case. White can't get a pawn to e5 in one move, but he can do it with a two-step push. Pawn from e3 moves to e4 forces the bishop to move because the pawn is protected 3 times, count m. Now pawn from e4 moves to e5 wins the knight after the queen moves. This time the rook on e1 provides the needed cover. Black has no effective counterplay here, but as an exercise imagine the position with white's pawn on h3 moved back to h2. Can something so subtle make a difference? It does, for then after 1. Pawn from e3 moves to e4, black has won. Knight moves to g4 threatening mate with queen takes at h2. The mate threat can be evaded in various ways, example with 2. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, or with the simple 2. Pawn from e4 moves to e5, forcing black's queen to retreat, but now the forking threat is over because black's knight has left f6. There are a few lessons to take away from the variation just discussed. Again, especially when you are not operating with checks, you have to ask what threats, particularly what checks and mate threats, your opponent might be able to make as an alternative to playing into your hands. In this case you would want to be especially wary of moves he can make by either of the pieces being threatened, and wary as well of threats against your king's position. If an enemy queen already is aimed at a square next to your king, as black's is here, remember that your opponent may be able to create a mate threat by simply adding another attack against that square. Maybe the mate threat can be defused easily, but it will cost you time. Finally, you can treat this as a little study in the value of a well-placed pawn. In the position as actually diagrammed, the pawn on h3 is doing quite helpful work by keeping black's f6 knight from jumping to g4. This is an important office of pawns, guarding squares where you don't want enemy knights planted. White to move. What is the best move? White sees that black has left two pieces, his bishop and his b6 knight, a square apart on the same rank, inviting a pawn fork. White's c-pawn needs 2 moves to get there, which is fine so long as the first move is a threat that requires a time-consuming reply. After pawn from c2 moves to c4, the knight moves, and then pawn from c4 moves to c5 wins a piece by forking the knight and bishop. But wait, where is the cover the pawn needs before it can attack a bishop that has the power to capture it back? There is none, but none is needed because after the knight on d5 moves, the bishop is pinned to its king by white's rook on d1. Recall that even if a target looks unsuitable because it can defend itself, it is powerless to do so if it is pinned. Thus whenever a piece moves, as the d5 knight does here, consider whether the move creates any open lines, any pins, etc. If black were to reply to the initial pawn push with n-pawn from b6 takes at c4, he would be leaving his other knight exposed to rook takes knight. Another question to ask when you imagine a piece moving is what it used to protect that may now be loose. Now let's think about counterplay for a moment. After pawn from c2 moves to c4, is it clear that black has nothing better to do than move his knight out of the way and allow the fork on c5? What attacks of his own does black have as options? He can play bishop takes bishop, freeing one of the pieces to the potential fork with a capture. The question is whether, after white recaptures pawn from h2 takes bishop, black has bought time to rush his knights to safety. Almost, but not quite. For when black played bishop takes bishop, the knight on d5 became pinned to its king and thus cannot now be moved. So after white recaptures on g3, the best black can do is take the c4 pawn with his other knight, and pawn from b6 takes at c4, thus allowing white to play rook takes knight d5 next move. White wins a piece for a pawn, but again the sequence is not quite as simple as it might look at first. Black to move. What is the best move? Black experiments with the effects of advancing a pawn and finds that pawn from e4 moves to e3 moves near to forking white's queen and rook. Of course white wouldn't allow that, but go farther and ask precisely what he could do to prevent it. A. White won't be playing pawn from d2 takes at e3 because the d2 pawn is pinned to his queen. In other words, black would have queen takes queen. If white then replies rook takes queen, black plays rook takes rook, checkmate. B. If white responds to pawn from e4 moves to e3 by moving his queen out of the way, say, to c2, black plays queen takes rook, checkmate. C. If white moves his rook to g1, black can't quite play bishop takes rook, because his own pawn would be blocking the way on e3. But he can use that pawn to take white's pawn on d2, and thus threaten to take the c1 bishop next move. Once white avoids that threat, with bishop moves to b2, then black has bishop takes rook after all, winning the exchange and a pawn after white recaptures. D. So suppose white instead plays rook moves to e1. This, too, fails to pawn from e3 takes at d2, forking rook and bishop. White plays bishop takes at d2, and then black has queen takes bishop, winning a piece. The important thing to notice is how a pawn can march not only forward but also diagonally by making a capture, expanding its potential to inflict forks. And then there is a larger point to observe, the pressure on white's king that indirectly drives the tactical sequence here. The king is stuck in the corner, the black queen's threat to mate on white's back rank, queen takes rook, effectively freezes white's queen in place, as it must defend against this possibility. These pressures on white's king do not enable black to mate, but they do constrain his other pieces severely enough to make a capture of material possible. It is important to appreciate how such accumulations of pressure against one point, especially though not only against the king, can end up paying off with gains elsewhere, as your opponent has to make sacrifices for safety's sake. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is a nice extension of the principle we are studying. Black examines every check as a matter of course, and finds 2, queen moves to e2 and queen moves to d3. Queen moves to e2 loses the queen without compensation. But queen moves to d3, check. Forces white to play queen takes queen, to which black replies pawn from e4 takes queen. Now re-examine how the board would look. The pawn on d3 would be attacking the white knight on c2, and if the knight moves, the pawn advances to d2, forking both rooks. Could it then be taken by the king? No, because the knight formerly on c2 will have moved, creating an open line for the black rook on b2 to provide cover for the pawn. So white is better off letting his knight on c2 get taken by black's pawn rather than letting the pawn march farther and take a rook. Think of this as a case where a pawn again marched diagonally with a capture, enabling it to deliver, or threaten, a fork that would not have been possible on its original file. But in order to move over a file, the e4 pawn needed white to put something on d3 that it could take. The something white's queen was drawn into place with a check. Queen moves to d3, check. Black to move. What is the best move? Another extension of the principles in this chapter. Black's possible checks: knight moves to c3, queen moves to f1, queen takes at c2, don't seem to go anywhere, so he experiments with captures and their consequences. Knight takes at b2 is interesting because white's only way to recapture would be with his king. Any exchange that causes the king to move is interesting. Now what do you see in the resulting position? The king and d2 rook are left a square apart on the same rank, in position to be forked by a pawn on c3. Black has no pawn on the c file. He does, however, have a pawn on the b file that is close by. If that pawn could capture something drawn onto c3, it could execute the fork. One way to get an enemy piece onto a square, as we have seen, is to put one of your pieces on the square in a threatening way that requires the enemy to recapture there. Best of all is a check. So black plays queen moves to c3, check. A move that attacks both white's king and queen. White has to play queen takes queen. White's king can't capture the black queen because the queen's square is guarded by a pawn, and if white moves his king, his queen gets taken with queen takes queen. After white's queen takes queen, black plays pawn from b4 takes queen, check. Forking king and rook with cover from black's own rook on c8. Black in effect has traded a knight for a rook. Again, see how the pawn was able to move over to deliver a fork on a different file after black drew a white piece onto that file that the pawn could capture. Now remember that all this assumes white replies to black's initial knight takes at b2 with king takes knight. White doesn't have to do that, he can skip the recapture, and indeed is better off doing so, in which case black wins a pawn rather than the exchange. It is another case where the threat of an eventual fork, if appreciated by both sides, leads to indirect gains. What are the strategic implications of pawn forks? Now a few thoughts on the strategic implications of our work on pawn forks. An easy way to get nailed by a pawn fork is to allow one of your pieces to get trapped on a square where it has limited motion. Bishops and knights near the side of the board are especially vulnerable to this type of trouble. A knight has a maximum of 8 flight squares when it is well placed, but when it's on the side of the board it may have only 4 or even fewer, and then it is easy for some of those squares to be occupied by its fellow pieces or to be under attack by the enemy. Likewise, a bishop in the middle of the board may be able to move in 4 different directions, but a bishop on, say, a5 with one of its own pawns behind it on b6 can only go one way, and has a maximum of 4 escape squares. There are lots of ways for pieces stuck in this way to be taken by pawns, either directly, they simply get trapped, or by being threatened in ways that force them to move onto squares where they get forked. There is additional reason to worry whenever you see pieces being used as defenders of other pieces or of pawns. For then if the man under attack gets taken, it is replaced by a new valuable target that may be loose or underdefended. When you do protect your men with other pieces, remember that as soon as the protectorate gets taken, you will be forced to move the guarding piece onto a square of your opponent's choosing. There it may become a target. It may be loose, it may lack the defensive powers of the piece it replaced, it may have greater value than the piece it replaced. Thus we saw a number of examples in this chapter of exchanges where pawns were taken and pieces performed recaptures and then the pieces got forked. Lesson: when you press a piece into service protecting a pawn, give thought to the danger that it can be drawn onto the pawn's square with a capture. Since pawn forks often are the residue of exchanges initiated by pieces, a bishop takes a piece and gets recaptured, then comes the pawn fork. It follows that you can expect better success with pawn forks when you have a well-mobilized army, pieces on open lines attacking lots of enemy squares and putting pressure on enemy pieces. Those are the positions that give rise to exchanges that make pawn forks and other double attacks possible. Notice generally, too, that victims of pawn forks often do not have good control of the center of the board. For a pawn to fork 2 pieces, it often has to pass through the center or be operating in a sector where it is more advanced than the pawns on the other side, otherwise the enemy pawns interfere with its attacking movements. Pawns established in the center are most likely to be in a strong position to make or threaten forks because it is easy for enemy pieces to gather on the same rank in their own territory where enemy pawns in the center can reach them. White to move. What is the best move? The discovered attack. Bishop discoveries. Introduction to discovered attacks generally. In a discovered attack, or discovery, one of your pieces moves out of the way of another, unleashing attacks on 2 enemy pieces at the same time, one by the unmasking piece and one by the piece unmasked. The enemy only has time to protect one of the threatened pieces. You take the other one. The diagram on the left shows the idea in skeletal form. If white plays his knight to f6, it gives check while unmasking an attack by his queen against black's queen. Black only has one move to respond to these 2 threats, and he has to spend it moving his king to safety. Then white plays queen takes queen. This at least is one of the patterns, a knight discovery. In its classic form, there are many variations on the theme that we will consider in due course. Discovered attacks always involve 2 offensive pieces, an unmasked piece and an unmasking piece. Every piece has the power to unmask attacks by others by moving off of lines that it occupies. Not every piece has the power to be unmasked, though. A knight, for example, can't be unmasked because it can't be masked in the first place. It jumps rather than slides, so it doesn't move along a line that can be temporarily blocked by a fellow piece. But the knight is a magnificent masker and unmasker of attacks by other pieces. Conversely, the queen is a great piece to unmask, but not a good masker of other pieces. It can't hide an attack by a rook or bishop because a queen can make all the same moves that either of those other pieces can. If a queen masks a threat by a rook, it already makes the same threat the rook would. The essence of a classic discovered attack is that before it is executed, neither piece directly threatens anything. After it is executed, both of them do. The plan of this section will be to take each of the major unmasking pieces, the bishop, the rook, the knight, and the pawn, and study one by one how they can unveil attacks by other pieces, what the unmasking piece looks like when it is poised to do this, how the germ of such an opportunity can be created, and how such ideas can be perfected and executed once they come into view. We will identify the visual patterns that signify the possibility of a discovered attack and practice identifying them until it becomes habitual. Mastering discoveries means learning new ways to think about the pieces and the relationships between them. You may be accustomed to thinking of bishops as pieces that attack diagonally and to regarding rooks as pieces that attack back and forth and from side to side. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Bishops attack diagonally and unmask vertical and horizontal attacks by rooks and queens. Rooks attack vertically and horizontally and unmask diagonal attacks by bishops and queens. Make it one of your goals to think of your pieces not just as individuals but as partners, as parts of a team whose efforts need to be coordinated. Discovered attacks are an example of coordination, as each partner makes the other more powerful. A bishop and rook on the same file, with the former masking the latter, often has far more destructive power than either piece by itself. Every discovered attack starts with a kernel consisting of two pieces, the piece to be unmasked and the piece that will unmask it. Once found, a kernel can serve to organize the rest of your thinking about what to do. You start looking for targets for each piece or ways to clear the lines between the pieces and their targets. We will be studying discovered attacks one kernel at a time, first the one where the bishop masks a rook or queen on the same file or rank, then the kernel where the rook masks a bishop or queen on the same diagonal, and so forth. We will emphasize spotting the kernel of a discovery because the practical importance of training your eyes in this way is so great. If you don't see the basic pattern when it's there, all the skill in the world at perfecting it won't be of much use. White to move. What is the best move? Introduction to Bishop Discoveries. We begin with discoveries where the bishop unmasks an attack by a queen or rook running up or down the board or from side to side. The position on the left is a skeletal illustration. If white moves his bishop to c4, it checks black's king. The bishop's move also unmasks, or discovers, an attack by the white rook on black's queen, which white will win next move. The job of the piece in front is to give check and thus keep your opponent busy. The piece in the rear then has its chance to carry out a capture. This is the typical pattern, though there are others we will study later. Before a discovered attack is unleashed, there always are three pieces in a line on a rank, file, or diagonal: the masked piece, the piece about to unmask it, and the target. When the bishop is doing the unmasking, the three pieces always are on a file or a rank. That is the kernel to look for in the positions that follow, a bishop blocking the path of a rook or queen. Then we'll follow up with standard questions, whether the two pieces in the kernel both have good targets, or whether targets might be created for them, whether the needed lines are clear or can be cleared, etc. We also can work toward discovered attacks by thinking about the suitable targets for them. Bishop discoveries always unmask attacks by queens and rooks. It follows that the target of the unmasked piece usually needs to be a queen or a loose piece for the attack to turn a profit. Unmasking an attack by your rook against a protected bishop, for example, isn't going to scare your opponent. The rook's target needs to be a loose piece or else a protected piece that is more valuable, such as the enemy queen, whether it's guarded or not. But now we're getting a little ahead of our story. Let's start by studying some positions involving discoveries by the bishop in simplest form. White to move. What is the best move? The classic pattern. We start with simple positions where a discovered attack is ready to be executed, one piece masks another, and both have good targets. Visually, most of these positions will take a common form. A bishop moves from the middle of the board to the edge near the enemy king, where it gives check or makes a capture. In the process it unmasks an attack up the board by a rook or queen, usually made from the back rank. In the diagram to the left, notice the position of white's rook and bishop on the d-file, a classic kernel of a discovered attack. The bishop masks the rook, if it can vacate the file in a forceful enough manner, e.g., with a check white will have the capture rook takes queen a move later. So white plays bishop takes at h7, check. Black is forced to spend a move protecting his king with king takes bishop, and now white takes black's queen with his rook. After black recaptures with rook takes rook, white has traded a bishop and rook for a queen and a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Find the kernel of a discovery for black. His bishop on d6 masks the black queen's path up the d-file. Meanwhile white's queen is loose on d3. If black can use the bishop to give check, he will be able to play queen takes queen afterwards. Black thus finds and plays bishop takes at h2, check. White is forced to play king takes bishop, or knight takes bishop, and now black takes white's queen. There were lots of ways to see this move. The three pieces aligned on the d-file were a tip-off, or you might have set out to examine every check, found only bishop takes at h2, and noticed that as a consequence of that move the d-file would be opened and also seen that white's queen is loose. Above all, however, study the relationship of the black bishop and queen here. The most important thing about the bishop in this position is what it masks. White to move. What is the best move? An almost identical pattern seen from white's side. You notice that the bishop masks the queen on d1, the queen otherwise would be able to take black's queen, which is loose. So white clears the bishop from the d-file and creates a distraction at the same time with bishop moves to g6, check. Black has to address the check. After he takes white's bishop, black's queen is lost. The more common checking move in this sort of position has the bishop taking the pawn on h2 or h7 and thus giving check to the castled king as we saw in the previous cases, but as this position shows, you want to look for every possible check you may be able to give with the unmasking piece. White to move. What is the best move? The relationship between white's bishop and rook on the b-file should jump out at you. Never fail to notice when pieces are paired like this, as it signals a possible discovery. Here white has a good target in black's loose queen, so he looks for a check he can give with his bishop and finds bishop takes at f7, check. Of course the move is useless as a serious threat to black's king, but its purpose is just to create a distraction. Black has to capture the bishop or move his king, and now white plays rook takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? The most important purpose of these first positions is just to train your eyes to see a single pattern, a bishop masking an attack by a rook or queen on the same file. Here the pieces are farther apart than before, but the pattern is structurally the same. White's job is to move the bishop out of his rook's way violently, preferably with a check. Bishop moves to g8, check. Does the job. Another example of a less usual check, as the bishop attacks the king from the rear. White will play rook takes rook next move, winning the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have a possible discovered attack? On the side of the board, where we find the familiar kernel of bishop masking rook on the same file. There is an easy target. Again, black has a loose rook, this time on a7, a valuable enough piece to justify sacrificing the bishop if necessary. White looks for a check the bishop can give as it moves out of the way. He finds bishop moves to c4, check. A nice backward move that wins the loose rook without need of a sacrifice. White to move. What is the best move? White has a bishop with a rook indeed, two rooks behind it on the same file. The arrangement signals the possibility of a discovered attack. White has a fine target for the rooks on c8. True, the rook there is protected by black's other rook at f8, but since white has two rooks trained on the square, the target is attacked twice and protected only once, and so is as good as loose. White looks for a check or other violent move to give with the bishop, and plays bishop takes at f7, check. However, black responds to this check. White next plays rook takes rook and wins the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? The unmasking piece makes a capture or threat. It isn't always possible for the unmasking piece to deliver a check, nor is it always necessary. Any move that creates two threats at once has winning potential. Here are some positions where the unmasking piece makes a capture or threat that serves the same distracting purpose as a check. In this first position, white's bishop and rook on the c-file are in the characteristic formation for a discovery, with black's loose knight providing a suitable target. White just needs to vacate the bishop from the file forcefully. The types of moves considered in the previous section won't work here because white has no checks. But he has another violent move at his disposal. Bishop takes knight, taking a knight and threatening the rook on f7. Black's king isn't threatened, but he nevertheless must redress his loss and protect his rook with king takes bishop, after which white can play rook takes knight, winning a piece. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's bishop masks an attack by his queen against white's loose knight on the e-file. Black looks for things he can do with his bishop that will keep white busy and allow queen takes knight a move later. The bishop has no checks and no good captures, so black considers everywhere the bishop can go, searching for a threat. He finds bishop moves to h3, not a check, but a threat against white's rook. White either loses the knight or trades a rook for a bishop, forfeiting the exchange. When you launch a double threat without a check at either end of it, as black does here, you have to be especially careful to think about your opponent's options in reply. Since you haven't given check, he will have a freer hand than he otherwise would. Maybe he can give check, wrest away the initiative, and escape your attack. In this case, black needs to notice that white has a check available in queen moves to a4. Is this trouble? No, because black can meet it with pawn from b7 moves to b5. But the point still holds: don't go forward with a tactical sequence, especially one that doesn't give check, without considering checks your opponent can throw at you in the middle of it. White to move. What is the best move? The same idea in slightly different visual form. White's bishop and rook on the d-file, of course, create a possible discovery against black's loose bishop. To unleash it, white needs a violent and distracting move for his own bishop to make. As the piece can't give check or make a good capture, white looks for threats the bishop can make and sees that it can attack the rook on b6. There are two ways to do it: bishop moves to c5 or bishop moves to c7. Which is better? Answer: bishop moves to c7 is better. In reply to bishop moves to c5, black could play rook moves to b7, both moving the rook to safety and using it to protect the bishop on d7. Bishop moves to c7 not only threatens black's rook and bishop at the same time, but also makes rook moves to b7 an ineffective reply. White wins the bishop. Notice the general point, though: you always want to be mindful of any way the enemy might be able to move the target and address your other threat in one stroke. White to move. What is the best move? You see white's bishop masking his rook, you see that the rook would attack black's queen if unmasked, you look for a move by the bishop that would take advantage of the situation. The bishop's only capture, bishop takes at h6, would be of no great concern to black. But look as well for threats white can make that would have to be taken seriously. Again white can use the bishop to threaten black's rook, this time with bishop moves to f4. After black moves his queen to avoid rook takes queen, white takes the rook and wins the exchange. Most often the point of a discovered attack is that the unmasking piece, the bishop in these examples, is sacrificed or creates a time-consuming threat so that the unmasked piece can capture an enemy target. But here the unmasked piece, the rook, creates the time-consuming threat, effectively allowing the unmasking bishop two moves, one to line up against black's rook, and the other to take it. Whichever piece plays the primary attacking role, the logic of the tactic is the same. You launch two attacks at the same time, leaving your opponent time to deal only with the more pressing of them. Soon we will give more detailed consideration to the most important positions where the stationary piece does the distracting and the unmasking piece does the attacking, the discovered check. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's bishop masks his rook on d7, and the rook is aimed at white's queen. What can he do with the bishop that will require a time-consuming reply from white? He has no checks or captures, so he looks for threats, and of course you would want to look for threats even if there were a capture to make, the threat might be the better move. With no white pieces on dark-colored squares, the bishop's prospects for threatening anything may seem dim. But your assessment of a position always should include an inspection of the enemy king and the pressures bearing on it, the constraints on its movement, and its exposure to checks. Black has a single check, queen takes at h2. By itself that move wouldn't be productive, because the queen would have no protection against king takes queen. If the bishop could add pressure to the h2 square, though, the possibility of queen takes at h2 would become a mate threat. Is there a way for the bishop to attack h2? Yes, with bishop moves to g1. Of course white escapes mate with king takes bishop, but mate isn't the goal is to require black to address the threat of mate and thus create time for the point, rook takes queen. Note that you want to consider all the ways white could reply to the mate threat, and especially any replies that also take the white queen out of harm's way and thus blunt both ends of the fork. Here white could respond to bishop moves to g1 with queen moves to h3, suddenly neither part of the fork works. But black still wins because now the d-file is clear for him to play rook takes rook. This position involves an important type of threat to remember, a threat not against a piece, but against a vulnerable square next to the king. When you have a piece aimed at a square adjacent to the enemy king, aiming another piece there may create a threat of mate, and if it does, that square can become a target just as sensitive as the king itself. White to move. What is the best move? Drawing the enemy king into place. What do discoveries look like when they lie 2 or 3 moves away? For openers, consider that a working discovery requires 2 enemy targets, one for the unmasking piece to threaten to create a distraction, ideally the king, and one for the unmasked piece to capture after the distraction does its work. In the positions to this point, both of those targets have been in place from the beginning. Now let's see some cases where one of the targets needs to be drawn onto place. The best target for a piece that unmasks a discovered attack is the enemy king, because a threat to it must be addressed by your opponent and his options will tend to be limited and safe for you. The king usually can't escape the check by running off to protect the other piece you are threatening or by inflicting a threat of its own. It moves too slowly. So when you have some of the ingredients of a discovery in place, it's worth some trouble to try to get the king into position to be checked by the unmasking piece. The most common ways of moving an enemy king are by checking it with another piece or by capturing a piece that the king protects. In the example to the left, white has the queen behind bishop kernel of a discovery in place, with black's queen ready to be taken on d5 if white can find a big enough threat to make with the unmasking piece. Since white is going for black's queen, and since moving the bishop exposes white to the risk of queen takes queen, the threat the bishop makes needs to be against black's king to be effective. Can the bishop give check? No, not yet. White's bishop travels on the dark squares, and the king is on a light one. So the first thing to consider is giving check with another piece in hopes of forcing the king onto a square where it can be checked by the bishop. White has one check he can give without ruining the discovery he is planning. Rook moves to h8, check. Black would be required to play king takes rook, moving his king onto a dark square. Now white can check with bishop takes rook, check. And after black plays king takes bishop, white has queen takes queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has the makings of a discovered attack on the f-file, where his bishop masks the capture queen takes queen. If only the bishop could vacate f5 and attack white's king. At the moment it can't be done, the bishop travels on the light squares and the king is on a dark one. Again, try handling this by checking the king with another piece, thus forcing it onto a light square where it can be checked by the bishop. Black can give check with his rook in 2 ways. Rook moves to d2 and rook takes bishop. After rook moves to d2, check. White can move his king to, say, g1 with nothing accomplished for black. But in reply to rook takes bishop, check. Black has to recapture king takes rook, moving his king onto a light square. If white instead moves his king, black plays rook takes queen a skewer. Now black checks with bishop moves to d3, check. Unveiling a threat against white's queen that white has no time to fend off.